Hello, friends! This is People Are Interesting with Jan K. In each episode of this show, unique individuals share stories that take us on a ride across ideas and places, featuring crocodile attacks in Indonesia, escaping war-torn Lebanon, and shark protection schemes in Mauritania. This podcast takes you where you've never been before. Enjoy and thank you for joining the club. Cool, and we're running. Today with me is Jacob, my dear friend, born and bred in Venezuela. Isn't that right?
Yeah.
Amazing. So we are gonna talk a little bit about, we're just gonna try to get a little bit into the soul of Latin America and understand what's going on there, or what has been going on there in the last few years. What's your earliest memory of your home country?
Wow, my earliest memory. I think, and it's probably very topical for how the weather has been in London, but basically the sun growing up at the beach, and yeah, I think those are probably my earliest memories, being at the beach, being outdoors, enjoying. Well, I mean, we went swimming today, so I think that's where my love for doing things outdoor, like water and things that are related to nature. Yeah, it's a lot of beautiful nature.
What's what part of the country did you grow up in?
So it's a city called Maracay, which is north. But I mean, most cities are in the north, but this one is kind of center north, and I mean, roughly used to be like nine. No, I'm actually exaggerating. It was like a million people. And it's not too far from Caracas. It's like an hour away.
Okay.
So it's like it's a sort of mid-size city. But yeah, north.
Just to get an idea, what size is the capital of Venezuela, Caracas?
I think from what I last remember, compared to a lot of Latin American cities, it's not that big, but probably something around 9 million.
Okay, that's huge. That's the size of London.
Yeah.
Roughly.
The metropolitan area of Caracas, I think, certainly. I will have to check, but that's what I remember.
And you've already mentioned that most of the cities and population is centered in the north of the country. Is that because of the jungle? It's kind of like down rainforest, I mean. Like
no, I think it's because it's the Caribbean and it's the coast. So it's pretty much all of our coast is on the north.
Yeah.
So, usually cities are built around water. Yeah. And we do have a big river, like the Orinoco River.
Yeah. And
you have like maybe one city down there, but that's like big mining towns, and then you have the Amazonas state, which I mean that's where you have most of the rainforest.
Okay.
And it's less populated as well. But yeah, I would say it's probably because of the Caribbean Sea.
Makes sense.
Yeah.
So you remember it's warm, you remember the beach. What's the interactions with people when you were growing up there? What are Venezuelans like when you compare it to other countries and societies in those countries that you visited?
Well, like the weather, warm. Yeah, people are very. I mean, we used to, they do this happiness index. And apparently Finland, it's for like 5th year consecutive, has won the happiest country in the world in this year. Venezuela was in that index even until recently. Despite the dictatorship, people were considered to be very happy, and it's an interesting idea, right? Because like, how do they measure happiness? But yeah, people are very jolly and very, very outgoing, musical. We're very musical people.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, I think that's pretty much how I would describe.
And in terms of family and friends, are people tend to the families tend to stick together. So, you know, like grandmas, aunts, this whole kind of network.
Do you mean as in like the family's important?
Yes.
Yeah, we're collective. Yeah, we're quite collective, and I think that's a big difference between how I grew up and how people live in the UK. I mean, I've lived in Oxford and London. Obviously, London is a massive city, so it's a lot more individualistic. But I feel like here, people are a lot more nuclear
Mm-hmm.
and even just more individualistic.
Yeah.
So yeah, I would definitely say we're much more collective. Family's an important thing. There are big families, big events all the time. Like families, your grandma, like your aunts. It's very important. Like people put family first. Yeah, I think so.
That's really nice. And in terms of relationships with other countries, Venezuela doesn't have any particular special relationships with other countries. So, for example, let's say maybe America would have special relationship with Canada because they're neighbors. They're culturally quite similar.
Yeah.
Or with the UK. Is there anything like that with Venezuela and other countries?
I would say Colombia. We were a country before we. So it's interesting because we got independence. We fought for independence, and we got it from the Spanish monarchy. And we were one territory then.
Yeah.
And this was like La Gran Colombia, so the Great Colombia. It included Venezuela, Colombia, Panama, Peru. And I always forget. There's like different stages of it, but it includes those main countries. Ecuador, sorry, I forgot Ecuador. Was Ecuador? Yeah, Ecuador was part of it. I'll have to fact check this, but anyway, yeah, it was the Great Colombia, and that was 1810, 1811.
Mm-hmm.
And we separated, I think, 1820. So good decade of being one territory. But I think it was a sort of negotiate. You kind of join forces and how you organize politically before you get the independence from monarchy. So I feel like after that it was more clear, sort of the territorial, like who rules where.
Was it amicable separation?
From a little. This is like where I always feel embarrassed that I just need to keep reading history because obviously studying here I've missed out on a lot of. But I think it was, from what I remember, Santander, he was the Colombian leader, and Bolivar just had disagreements and to be honest, even within Venezuela, the territory that is now Venezuela, you still had like strong leadership, and you had a sort of situation typical, similar to what's his name in Italy. It's not coming to my head now.
What did he do? Berlusconi.
No, no, I'm talking about like the formation of Italy, like the unification of Italy a long time ago.
Okay.
What's his name?
I know, Garibaldi.
Garibaldi, exactly.
Okay.
Exactly. Oh, there we go. We got there. Garibaldi. I feel like there was a situation. I mean, this is me being very revisionist and putting my own opinion on it.
Mm-hmm.
With a guy called Paez in Venezuela, and he was in the south. And he was a very strong leader, and him and Bolivar also had disagreements, but that state that that area that he was the leader of, still part of Venezuela. But anyway, Santander and Bolivar were the two leaders, and it was also Bolivar's dream, like a sort of Simón Bolívar wanted. Simón Bolívar was what people consider to be the liberator of Venezuela. He was the strong leader that had the connections. He came from wealthy Spanish. He was a wealthy Spanish offspring, what we would consider to be Venezuelans of Spanish descent, and they had like a sort of nobility, in terms of like class. Well, like Venezuelan-born Spanish people, basically.
Is it still a thing?
No, I mean obviously you do have the sort of social class and like racism that kind of stems from that.
Really? So if you were to kind of, how is society kind of dissected, so to say? How does it divide itself? Let's say here in the UK, you very much can tell someone by their accent or what school they went to. Potentially even the part of the neighborhood they live in, or even more so in the US. Things like that. What are the kind of things like that? Factors. In Venezuela, if there are any at all.
No, there are many. I mean, accent is obviously, and I think that's probably global. It probably happens in every language. Accent, and then there's also the sort of urban versus rural division. Latin American countries definitely suffered a lot from the attempt at industrializing, because we sort of in international scheme we were always sort of agro exporting countries, and when agriculture wasn't good enough, and we had the development of like manufacturing centers in big cities, and people had to mass migrate from the countryside to the cities. That created a lot of tension. It's a lot of tensions.
I see.
And it probably demarcated it even further. But yeah, what are the factors? Yeah, accent is number one, I would say. In terms of neighborhoods and things like that, like when I compare it to the UK, I feel like here is less. Well, maybe it's just because I haven't really created a family here, I guess.
Yeah.
And so I don't know about these things, but I always hear the whole thing about is your kid in state school or public school, or like what they call public school, but it's private school. That happens in Latin America and Venezuela. It does happen. Public school is obviously low quality because it hasn't been invested in, and then private school tends to be whoever can afford it. So in terms of like education, there are some similarities there, but I feel like it's not as political as it is here. In terms of like schooling, because I hear stories of parents of neighbors falling out just when one neighbor finds out that the kid of the other neighbors goes to public school, like i.e. they're wealthy or like putting their, and it's I just find that very fascinating, but also just a bit like wow. And in Latin America, for us, it's like even people that can't afford it just try to work towards that. They try to earn enough money so they can put people through private school. Some can't, obviously. Some people can't do that. They have no choice. Some people really, really like the last penny they have, they just spend it in because they know that the education is going to be dramatically better. Here, I guess it's less of an argument to go private because public school is good. It's like good for good quality. I imagine some schools are better than others in terms of neighborhood. But I think generally the public school system here is good. So there's less of an argument, whereas in Latin America or Venezuela, it's not the case. Neighborhoods, yeah, but you also get a mixture. You can get those pictures that you sometimes see on social media, which apply, by the way, like Latin America is a massive region, but there's a lot of things that happen in every country, even though we're not the same and we have different cultures and different, every day. But you see those pictures of, a big highway going through Caracas, or going through Sao Paulo, or going through Mexico City, and it's the same story. You have a massive highway, and then one side of the highway you have shanty towns, like slums, and then the other side you have like these massive skyscrapers or big houses with pools and things like that. So we do have a lot of that segregation, but we also get the in between. Recently, somebody was saying, "Oh, like London is an amazing place because you get sort of working class estate, right in front of a new build and things like this." And I'm like, I don't think that's necessarily integration, and I don't think that it's like an ideal. The ideal should be that that everyone lives in that sort of economic conditions and more egalitarian. But that's a different story.
Yeah, that is a different story. What are the national holidays in Venezuela? What are the big things that you celebrate?
Well, Carnival. No, I'm kidding.
No, you don't celebrate Carnival?
No, we do. It's a big but I'm only saying it because it's February usually, so it's around this time of year that people celebrate Carnival.
Oh, really?
Yeah. And it's big parties, piss ups, and and people go to the beach a lot. It's just a party, really. Just
is it kind of like in Rio where you have a parade in the city, or what's the?
I think this is where. No, it's not in the same. Well, it's also probably Rio. Create a whole industry of their carnival.
Yeah.
So they're good at that. They're good at marketing
Mm-hmm.
their cities and their culture. You wouldn't have parades per se. I think it probably at the sort of very local level, maybe. I don't know, but it's not like we have all the big.
Do you have anything like an Independence Day or something like that?
Yeah, we don't really. I mean, we have those days in terms of days off, but people do not celebrate. Like in the U.S., they celebrate 5th of July. Well, it's the 4th of July.
4th of July, I think
July.
it is.
It's
Yeah,
not the
I
5th
think
of
you're
July.
right.
5th of July is actually in Mexico.
Oh, really?
Yeah.
Oh, nice.
And no, in terms of holidays, people are big on Easter. Again, we call it Semana Santa.
Mm-hmm.
So like Holy Week.
Holy Week. Okay.
But there's a lot of people who are very religious and Catholic. They do the whole thing. They're not eating meat. They eat fish, and but generally, like, people just use those days just to go to the beach and go away and celebrate, and really, even though it's not about that, right? Like Easter is not about that, but they get together. They get with their families.
Yeah.
Other holidays. I'm probably missing like a very obvious one. I feel like I am. But yeah, no, it's not. It's not like here or like in France, for instance, they celebrate Bastille Day.
Mm-hmm.
We don't have that.
Okay.
No.
It's just those kind of like warm-up questions. I want to get a feeling for that place before we get to more current events. What was people's economic and social and like political situation when you were growing up before kind of things imploded there? What was it like for normal people? Because I can imagine that people who are well-to-do, they do quite well everywhere. But what were the average people doing in Venezuela? How were they?
I mean, I first have to begin by saying I have to admit, my life was not average. I've been very privileged, but because I come from very different families, different histories, I have seen like the spectrum.
Yeah.
And the people that I've shared and grown up with have always been from very, very different backgrounds. So, but my actual life and my conditions and things haven't been those a lot of times. But I would say things from what I can remember and from my parents, and things were just normal, like what you would consider in a democratic country. People could work in different industries. They could advance. The career progressions. They had opportunities. People didn't think of migrating. Like moving away from Venezuela was, something that people would do for a couple of years. Whoever could do that, but there were a lot of opportunities. Public universities. I didn't mention this, but like school system in terms of like school level is what I said earlier. But public universities are the best ones in Venezuela, which is a sort of a flip coin. Yeah. So that's when you do get this sort of leveling out of social inequality in some aspects, because people do get opportunities. And this comes from, just simply the creation of public universities throughout the 20th century, and investment in those universities. So yeah, that's sort of the testament to there was a democratic culture in the country. Mm-hmm. I don't know, Venezuelan people are also very cultured, mm-hmm. Regardless of, well, at least that's how I can remember it, and also the people I always got exposed to in every social occasion. And so I think it was is a resourceful country, and that's why probably it's very attractive to criminals, and maybe that's why it's in the situation that it is today. But yeah.
What happened then? Because it's not the same place that it used to be 10 years ago or 15 years ago. What happened there since the picture you've just described?
Well, I think the picture I was just describing is even it's like, probably 15 years ago, but that's already within the period of when things started to get worse. Some people, and this is where it gets sort of partisan, and people attribute the start of Chavez government as like the big moment, and that's the big evil that created all evils in Venezuela. But it's not true. He definitely was the start of the massive decline, because he was opportunistic, populist, demagogue, whatever you want to call it. He had we had the commodities boom. Probably in the turn of it, 2000, was it 2000 around 2004, 2005? But yeah, like 2000s, right? Mm-hmm. You had the commodities boom, and we are a massive oil country, or we used to be, and even production, we have massive refineries and things. So we had the commodities boom. There was a lot of capital flowing in Venezuela, a lot, and this was during Chavez. So it was tons and tons of money.
Could you kind of perceive it on the street, and like?
That's where like the thing is, Venezuela has been a wealthy country because of oil, but with Chavez, the thing is,
has it become a wealthy country compared to, let's say, other countries in Latin America because of oil? Like, was Venezuela much better off than, let's say, their neighbors, or?
Yeah, because of oil.
Yeah,
because we were top. We have the highest reserves in the world, which that's not man-made. That's just simply the soil. But we also were at some points in recent history the top producing country. We're not a we're a consumer, but we're not a producer anymore. Producing country, because now at least 2 decades of poor investment from Chavez's government. So what did he use that money for? We had the highest price per barrel during his time because of the commodities boom. And where did that money go? You have studies, and like there's some scholarship now about this, and what he did is what a populist would do, and it's just spend the money in social programs, a lot of them, but it's a sort of short-term reward social programs. Very flashy type of like marketing type of programs that he never actually fulfilled as he said he would. He created this one called Misión Vivienda, like housing mission, where he was meant to build, like, I would just throw a random number, like 200,000 homes by the next 2 years, whatever. And these were all going to be, state houses, but then people would have a house with like dignity, and this was the whole promise. And I think even years after the supposed deadline, it was only built for like 10%. All of the projects that he ever, there was like this massive railway project that now you still next to the highway, one of the main highways, you see the bottom of, like, because he was going to build it on top as well, in the air. He was not going to build a railway as most countries with railways do, which is on the ground. So it was big money laundering infrastructure projects. I can't think of a single infrastructure project that he actually completed. But yeah, anyway, he spent the cash, but also he pocketed the cash, and all of his entourage pocketed the cash. And, massive corruption. And it's not that Venezuela didn't know corruption before him, but it just became blatant corruption, and one of the most disgusting sort of power grabs because of simply the way that he got there as well. It's a lot to unpack in terms of what the Chavez phenomenon, how do you get populists to gain power, and he was basically that's an opportunistic, power grabbing, power hungry kind of man, megalomaniac, and so we saw that. I mean, that's why the deterioration came. All of his promises, but no investment, and massive virtue signaling, whereby his whole policy was that he was a socialist, believed in equality and all principles, but he never really backed that with evidence. It was all for the show, all for the camera. And nowadays we have above 80% of the population are considered to be in poverty.
Wow.
And at the beginning of his government was probably roughly around 15%.
Wow.
And this is just me with, sort of approximate estimates from what I can remember.
Yeah.
I mean, certainly poverty levels right now are above 80%.
So so there was a lot of corruption under Chavez, right? That he dies, I think.
Yeah.
Then Maduro comes in.
Yeah.
And then things really start to unravel. What was going on? Why this decline happened so quickly and so dramatically?
Well, what I was explaining, like the commodities boom was probably what allowed Chavez to not invest that much, but still having kind of disposable cash to spend it on things that seemed like he was doing something. But also you have to think, like, it's also the personalistic aspect of populism. He was a great, spokesperson. He was charismatic, even though he wasn't particularly good looking or anything. He just had this charisma, and he just said what people wanted to hear. And one thing, the only thing I do give to Chavez was that, and sometimes people don't want to admit it, but he did shine a light on social issues. Venezuela, as many Latin American countries, very unequal, despite having opportunities and problems of racism and history that I was just mentioning earlier. And he spoke about these things. So he kind of rode the wave of, let's talk about our past, let's talk about racial issues, and let's talk about all these uncomfortable truths. That's the only thing I give to him. But he used it as an instrument for him to gain popular approval. But without actually doing anything to improve their conditions. You do get the off cases where people who align, and then this is when it gets very political, where he started persecuting opposition as soon as he got into power. He censored top TV channels and radio stations that were dissident. He attacked, what I was gonna say, then I kind of digressed, talking about him supposedly espousing these values of socialism. Then he started attacking the private sector, saying, greedy. And there is a lot of that. There were a lot of multinationals in Venezuela, and so there's a political aspect to it that you can understand. But in terms of the actions that followed, he attacked the private sector, but then he put exchange, like sort of currency controls. That was one of the first things that he did as well within his first government. And this was, to control the sort of currency flows in Venezuela and things like that. And he just had a massive fuck up in economic policy that, to this day, like I admire the Venezuelan economists certainly, that try to make sense of the aftermath of all the things that Chavez did. So yeah, I mean, it's the what was I saying? I was saying I came back to the point of the policies. What was I saying? I went back and forth.
No, we were talking about Maduro. So where we were getting to right now was about to start talking about the humanitarian.
The sharp decline.
Yes.
Well, I mean, so yeah, I guess what I was saying just builds up to that he created the conditions. It was not Maduro. First of all, Maduro still is pretty much a shell of a government. And I think every decision is not taken by him. He doesn't have the credentials, and even though some people like to undermine him because there's a lot of things that I'm not even going to mention, but there's a whole campaign about how he's dumb. He didn't finish school, etc., etc., etc. Typical things that are attacked in terms of leader that is unfit to rule.
What's the background of Chavez and what's the background of Maduro? Are they like just kind of guys from like a yard, like
from countryside? Yeah.
Yeah. What I'm trying to figure out is where do they come from, and the people who were in charge of Venezuela at that time? Because you said they were populists. What kind of social background they came from?
Well, that's part of the story, right? Like, if you wanted to have a sort of anthropological reason why they are doing what they're doing, because you're like, how you're hating, how you hate your country, or like, yeah, if you want power, but I don't know. There's many hypotheticals, but they're from working class, very humble backgrounds. Chavez was from the southern state. That's where a lot of the agriculture and sort of cattle and things of that industry come from in Venezuela. And Maduro, so also there's weird stories about his origins. People say that he's Colombian, and it doesn't really matter if he's Colombian or not. It's but yeah, humble backgrounds. I mean, he was a bus driver actually, and that was really his last profession before becoming a militant. The most recent background for them before getting into power as a movement, as a political power, was they're from guerrillas actually. So
okay.
Yeah. So, and this is the thing.
It's quite common in Latin America, by the way, isn't it? For some sort of military people getting in charge of the
Yeah,
government.
you have militias, you have like paramilitary. I mean, in the world, really, you do have them, and common is like it's a difficult one because you for instance, the case of Colombia, yeah, it is guerrillas, but you don't hear those stories. That you didn't hear of these stories from Venezuela a few years ago. We've had the Colombian guerrilla by border, and all these rural sites are in the south, especially towards the literally just the same region I was talking about, because that's the side of Colombia. We border with Colombia.
Yeah.
But they're from guerrillas. They were what they call themselves revolutionaries, and this is where it gets very interesting. Is because Chavez tried to get into power different times through coup d'état.
Yeah.
And he was I think he was a cadet, like low ranking military man.
Yeah.
And him and a group of others that kind of believed in Fidel Castro's ideals decided that they needed to do a revolutionary take on on power. And
Oh yes, because Venezuela has good ties with Cuba and with Russia.
Because of Chavez, yeah.
Yeah, that's
because
true.
of Chavez, not prior to that. Interestingly, this is like a sort of interesting historic fact that I couldn't believe it when I learned about it, was that. So first, for clarification, he tried to take power in Venezuela twice, and I think some people say 3 times, but twice through a coup d'état, like 1993. I think that almost like the year after that, or 2 years after that, 1995, and he realized that didn't work, and then he just changed his whole image, suit and tie, created a political party, and then ran for the election in 1998, and that's how he got to power.
Funny, because
the same decade. This is the same decade. So that's how short-sighted we can be when it comes to political leaders. He did become this messianic figure, and because we lived in bipartisan or bipartitism, these two political parties that were always in power ever since we had democracy.
Which were?
One called COPEI and the other one called Acción Democrática, or AD, or AD. And these two parties, would just ruling the country, and people were just fed up. This corruption scandal in this one, this corruption scandal in this other one. Nobody is really paying attention to the country. So it's certainly not also the social issues that I just mentioned. But yeah, going back to Cuba, and this sort of Cold War type of alignment. Some people trace Nicolás Maduro's sort of guerrilla making to sort of Castro sympathizing groups. And then the interesting event that I couldn't believe was that Castro himself tried to invade Venezuela sometime in 1974. I'll have to check. I don't have my phone, but I will double check, because I think it's a very, I just couldn't believe it. And he tried to get through the northwest of the country because we have mountains, we have a big mountain range dividing the cities and the beach.
Okay. Just near the coast, relatively.
Yeah, and I just couldn't believe it. It was crazy, and it was him and 20 men. It was not even a battalion.
Yeah. And what the point was, to topple the government, or?
I don't really know what he was doing, but clearly he didn't know either.
I mean, probably was it Castro, yeah? So Castro, I would imagine that he wanted to spread the revolution, right? Like a left-wing revolution, like a communist revolution.
Yeah, but it's just interesting.
Yeah, that's ballsy.
Very funny.
Because he probably thought that people will just go with him, so he will take people who are there.
Yeah, look, I just Googled, online about Fidel Castro invasion Venezuela, and there's plenty of articles that wrote about this, but I think it's 1967.
1967. Okay.
Tried to invade Venezuela in 1967.
Wow, that's a crazy move. That's a crazy
May
move.
8th, 2 small boats carrying a dozen heavily armed fighters made landfall near. Let's get all these ads. But yeah, anyway. So, interesting piece of history during the Cold War as well, right? If you think 1967, that's just before Vietnam and after the Bay of Pigs. So big for me, especially for Venezuela's current state. You can trace a lot of interesting historical moments that you're like, wow, so this is where it comes from as well. And I feel in Venezuela we have been living the Cold War, even after the Cold War, certainly with Chavez. And now, Putin was speaking about Venezuela right before the Ukraine situation exploded. So, are we really, is the Cold War really over? But yeah.
So the situation got really bad in the country. It got, essentially I'm trying to figure out what happened that there has been so many refugees from Venezuela, because that's the headline I grabbed when it was happening. What's the whole situation with that?
So yeah, I think I've been trying to cover a lot, but because it's hard, right, to and especially the way that I think, I'm trying to understand them. Why did Chavez and Maduro join a guerrilla? Why do guerrillas exist? And I used to be like, it's just political greed, and why is Castro, and I absolutely do not sympathize with any of them, but not because of the supposed ideals that they espouse, but because of the reality that, the Castro family are a massive land-owning family in Cuba. All of the whole island is owned by them, and so it's more about the opportunistic aspect of these people. But guerrillas existed because guerrillas are just, by definition, are peasant armies. Just people that are dissatisfied with the state that didn't provide for them. So if you understand that, and you understand why maybe Chavez, people will always describe him as a resented a human being, and that's why he had this fight of against the rich and against the elite and against he was a political outsider. The situation got bad because of all of these things, the polarization of the country socially, the degradation of everything, education, health system, underinvestment, the poor management of Chavez himself, the currency controls, the restrictions of freedoms, political freedoms and economic freedoms. All of these things contribute to the 2010 decline. We had protests the whole time he was in power, and when Maduro came in the picture after Chavez died, he was just a shell of that. He was a puppet, and that's what I was just saying. The people that were around Chavez it's when you talk about Hitler, right? So was it Hitler, was it Himmler, or who was it that who can you attribute this massive historic event to? And that's how I see it. It's him and everybody else. So with Maduro, I don't attribute him and his decisions because I know it was not him. I know that it's the whole entourage of same opportunistic people.
Right.
But that 2014, to be more specific, 2014, that's when we had the oil prices crashing. And even though we're not an oil producing country, that just kind of was the last bit of, the last drop that needed to burst this massive dam and wash away the economy and people and But also a very unsafe country because of all of these things. Underinvestment means less money in the country, like the flight of capital, the brain drain throughout the 2000s. All of these things create the conditions for people to be unhappy, to be in need, and a lot of crime. The crime rates just
What kind of crime?
spiked.
What kind of crime are we talking? Are we talking just robberies on the street, just casually, or like gangs?
Now we are at the point we didn't. It's not that gangs didn't exist; they probably existed like in every city, in every country, but you saw this emergence of a new type of crime, like organized crime, that we didn't have. These new figures. We have a figure called Pran, and that's just a new word, a new sort of new type of criminal created under the Chavez.
What are the characteristics?
Well, Pran is actually somebody who is sort of prisons in Venezuela, like high security prisons, are supposed to be. They have these towers, and the higher up you are in those towers, the more severe crime you committed. So those guys who were at the very top just started, ruling the prisons, and because of sort of there was complacency from Chavez as well to kind of, I don't really know, the country just became so unsafe, and these guys created their own sort of security systems, and they were the ones ruling the prisons, not the National Guards. Chavez also kind of tried to get rid of everyone in the armed forces that wasn't with him. So these are all the conversions of so many factors and so many chess pieces that he moved. But yeah, generally, I mean, if you have really poor conditions, then crime is just gonna be rife, and yeah, we have very organized crime, like highly organized crime now. We have more guerrillas, we have more armed groups, or any sort of evil, name it, like it's in Venezuela right now.
And people, but there was also opposition, right? There was, what was his name starting with G? Guaido, yeah. So those guys, there was also political fight going on, right?
Yeah, I mean, there has been ever since Chavez got into power, but because again Chavez was a very successful spokesperson, I think, and the sort of social currency that he was able to earn just from having mass support from all social classes, certainly the working classes. He just could, and he did something very intelligent. He just ruled by referendum, supposedly to say, because he was like, oh, I'm just gonna make this very bottom up, so every decision I should make should be backed by a referendum, so people have a vote, have a say. While on paper that sounds very good, what he was doing was disarming the opposition, because if the opposition stood against political will of the people, then obviously they were not going to be very popular. So yeah, and also the opposition has had its flaws, kind of their part, because the opposition became these two parties that were the political class became opposition,
Mm-hmm.
So it's a very interesting thing where this one guy comes as an outsider but doesn't even come within any of those two parties, creates his own party. This other party another party emerges, and these people get displaced. These two big political powers get displaced, so they become opposition. But because it has decades of being against each other, they just can't agree,
Yeah.
But then you also have the individual interests of those leaders, and so fragmented that the opposition hasn't been really successful. But also Chavez has been, or was, a very good strategist.
Right. So, in terms of the plight of people, they have been emigrating out of the country, right? Essentially, a lot of Venezuelans had to move out because of all this turmoil, the terrible economic situation, the crime,
Yeah.
probably no food at some point. I remember no medicine. I remember all those things in the media. So what was
Scarcity? Yeah, we had a massive scarcity because of these. The inability of the government, because of the currency controls that I mentioned. Companies have needed to get approval of the government to actually access dollars at a preferential rate.
Yeah.
Because otherwise they will have to do it. And then this created obviously a black market for currency exchange. So it was very difficult for businesses to thrive and actually import things. But again, Chavez underinvestment in industries. There was no national production of almost anything. So what do you have to do? You have to import everything.
Yeah.
So we became even more of an import country, like completely, deficit in a trade balance and things like that. So that's what created the scarcity. It's because we don't produce anything and everything got to be imported, but nobody has the dollars to import that.
Yeah.
Etc. Etc.
So, what happened with all those people who decided to leave?
Well, and this is where I get technical because I guess that's what I was interested in studying is the migration waves. That big one that received a lot of media attention recently since 2015, 2016. You can say that that's a migration with the mixed migration. There was a lot of people there that were most in need in Venezuela. People that just didn't have the means to leave Venezuela just tried to find the most desperate way to leave the country.
Mm-hmm.
And that's where you had the big, and it's still happening today, every day, people walking to the Colombian border. And, we are a massive country, like you can fit the whole of the UK in Venezuela, the whole of the UK, not only England. And people walking from, Caracas to the Colombian border, that's anywhere from, 500 kilometers, or not walking necessarily there, but some people would hop on a bus from Caracas to the closest town to the Colombian border, but then walk across from that town to the nearest city in Colombia, which would be again 200, 300 kilometers, things like that. And those definitely people in need, people from working class backgrounds but low income, and it's just a desperation. People don't want to leave, and this is a sort of thing, an understanding of migration that a lot of people have is they're coming here. They don't want to. Nobody wants to leave their home. Nobody wants to be a guest in someone else's house forever. So yeah, desperation.
So most Venezuelans went to Colombia.
Yeah, in terms of that sort of latest wave of migration, yes.
What were the other waves?
Well, some scholars speak about, earlier in 2010, for instance, which was obviously after the credit crunch and currency controls and things like this. And they say that was more middle class people, which I think it probably is accurate. And then you have a migration when Chavez got to power around the late 90s. But these things are also arbitrary. So if you say, the wave 1998, but to be honest, a lot of people did migrate then because of who Chavez was, and they knew who Chavez was. And it's sad, you just have to pack your bags, and because his political persecution just started as soon as he got to power.
Yeah.
He booted out the 90% of staff in Venezuela's oil company, which is a nationalized oil company ever since 1970.
Mm-hmm.
He just booted them all out because they voted against. They didn't vote for him, and this massive witch hunt started ever since he got to power. So all of those people migrated. So I feel like that's a big, massive brain drain that happened then. All of his massive oil engineers, especially oil industry,
Mm-hmm.
migrated to Canada, migrated to Saudi Arabia, Bahrain, name an oil country and there's going to be a Venezuelan engineer there for sure.
I see what you mean. And in terms of what's going on with people who made their way to Colombia, what's going on with them now? Because there's so many of them there, right?
Yeah, well, from the last numbers I checked, which wasn't that recently, it should be above 2 million that live in Venezuela, in Colombia.
Mm-hmm.
So it is the highest recipient of Venezuelan migrants and refugees. Yeah, Colombia is. And sorry, what was you were asking about whether it was the biggest one? Yeah.
What's
What's
their
the
situation
situation
there?
now?
Yeah.
Well, it's so I've worked with small NGOs there, and the situation is appalling because people are still crossing, and you see young families with kids, pregnant women. They themselves were saying, earlier, when this all started, it was mainly men, and you would just see quite young and fit people that, they still need care, but now you got, certainly in the last 2 years, there's women and pregnant women and old people, and it's just very, very sad because just nobody should be forced to do this. Nobody should be. And walking hillsides that are, next to, big, so it's an Andes mountain. So, well, it's towards the Andes, but it's not the actual Andes mountains. Very difficult conditions, steep mountains, steep roads, and people are walking because not a lot of people can afford. They don't have money. They get to Colombia, and obviously Venezuelan currency is super devalued. Like,
Mm-hmm.
we have the highest inflation. You have hyperinflation. We have our money's worth nothing. So when you get to Colombia, even less so. And also, to get to Colombia, the amount of things that happen to you. You get the guerrilla in Venezuelan side, the armed forces in Venezuelan side trying to get money out of you.
Yeah.
You get the Colombian side, and there's the Colombian guerrilla. And this is obviously if you cross through official points, maybe you have less difficulties in terms of crime and violence. But at some point, those points were closed, and there's not many crossing points that are official. So people just, because of out of desperation, they just cross the river and do it through what they call trochas, which is just river sides. They just cross the river literally and go through the little mountains, the little fields, and that's all controlled by guerrilla on both sides.
Mm-hmm.
So they just go through so much just to get to another country where they don't even know what's gonna happen, how am I gonna work. Colombia's also been very accepting of Venezuelans because Colombian refugees, because of the internal armed conflict in Colombia for the last 60 years, they flew to Venezuela, or they just escaped to Venezuela. So this is sort of recent history, and that old history as well that I was talking about. We are kind of sibling countries.
Yeah.
But it's difficult. Colombia has also a very difficult socioeconomic position, and an armed conflict that hasn't finished, and 8 million people that are internally displaced persons. So that's technically like being a refugee, but within your own country. you were displaced by the conflict, all these guerrillas or paramilitaries or armed groups just pushed you out of your home. So it's a horrible, horrible conundrum, because there's just no way out. You're like, well, I can't go back to Venezuela because I can't eat there.
Yeah.
I can't earn money.
So what are those people doing? Are they kind of trying to settle down in Colombia? Can they work there? Can they access healthcare, whatever healthcare there is there? What's their like legal status there?
It's very difficult. First, it has changed in the last few years, but it's so unregulated, and especially when you don't cross through official points, is even less so, because if you cross through official points, then supposedly you are able to access more information to begin with, but also get given a status. And Colombia does not want to acknowledge Venezuelans as refugees, because that attaches international responsibility on what you need to provide them with, and it sort of guarantees that Colombia is just not ready or willing to do, because of what I just mentioned.
Yeah.
Is not in the position, but also it just doesn't seem politically feasible either. So social care, no. It's, if you have a regular status and you're regularized, then maybe you can start working, which because this has also to do with the sort of health system and how Colombia is organized. Not because Colombia doesn't want to, it's because to access healthcare there, you have to be either working or paying private.
Mm-hmm.
Because you have the one that you're working obviously means you're paying taxes, which contributes to healthcare.
Yeah.
So then you have a right. So social care is for children, women that are pregnant, and old people. It's just humanitarian care. But you're not you can't just go to a doctor and say get checked.
Yeah. Okay. I see.
There has been some changes where like there's been permits implemented, and they call it a regularization of Venezuelans in Colombia. So they're trying to create new forms of residence cards that allow people to access things, but primarily just access work.
Yeah.
But you have a lot of people that didn't arrive at the right date, because all these things are quite arbitrary, right? It's like, if you arrive between this month, then you're eligible to apply for this permit, and this permit is only for a year. So what happens after that year? And these things like that, all these conditions that people have to navigate in, and they're not aware of, because it's bad enough that I've had to walk from Caracas to Bogota to then actually worry about. And there's big resources, international organizations. You have obviously the UN, High Commissioner for Refugees in Colombia, but believe me, most of the work and heavy lifting is done by local small NGOs, as in every situation. They don't get too involved. The big organizations, they don't get too involved. All this money. Typical problem that we have is all the money goes on top, and management and like people with some jobs, and then where does the money actually go to? It's very complex conditions. But there's still migrating, people still walking over.
Yeah, so it's not getting better at all, right, in Venezuela? Not really.
No, and it won't get better until these people are out of power, until the situation is quite sad. And the most difficult thing about going and working there, and I only done it in terms of physical, very limited, because I just was there for a few weeks, and after that I just tried to work
in Colombia
for them. In Colombia. Okay. Just work for them from abroad, which has also been difficult, especially COVID and things. I wanted to go back and I couldn't. Anyway, the sad thing when you're there, and this happens to all the staff and all the people that are on the ground, is you're helping people and trying to support them and alleviate their current needs, but you just can't alleviate their long-term needs. It's like,
Yeah.
how are they gonna integrate? Are they gonna, be fine in a year? What's gonna be their status? And that's a big difficulty. And these NGOs, like, we're trying to change the focus and think of migration not as a humanitarian care only, but in terms, like, with the focus on integration and trying to see the long term and try to help people in that way rather than just humanitarian care. But when you're talking to refugees, migrants, you don't want to say all these things to them. You don't want to spell out what the uncertain future could be. I'm sure that they are all thinking about it, but you, as somebody who's supporting them, you're in a difficult position where you need to help them, but you can't worsen their mental health about what they're living through.
Yeah.
That's why obviously you need mental health professionals, but there's often none. I know that the neglection of mental health is an area of investment as well. The mental health of people the volunteers and people who work for these organizations. So yeah, it's a very, very, very difficult.
Well, I mean, I didn't expect this conversation to be particularly cheerful.
Yeah.
To be completely honest with you.
Yeah.
But yeah, it is grim. What are just to finish it off? What are some of the kind of like cultural markers for Venezuela? Maybe like some books or some music albums. I don't know. What maybe a particular kind of dress.
That's funny because I was thinking about this, I think yesterday. Because tomorrow I've got a project I'm supporting for well, it's not with Save Latin Village, but it's with the network of people, Latin American people in London, and it's a project called Mi Gente, like my people. And the photographer was saying, well, can you wear whatever you want to wear, but if you wanted to wear typical clothes from your country, that'll be amazing as well. And I was looking, I remember when I was a kid, you would just wear like the costero outfit, like a costero means like a coast person, coastman, or like a fisherman. So you have like the white shirts, white or like khaki trousers. You have like a red handkerchief that you tie around your neck. And you have these sort of espadrilles that people make in Venezuela, typical shoes, and a big straw hat.
Nice. That sounds mellow.
That's from my. I mean, that's a sort of applies to the whole country, but that's from my state. Like that's a typical dress. Books. I mean, that's it really depends, like what people are interested. But
I mean, clothing was good. We don't need an answer to like an example of each one of them.
Music is Oscar de Leon. Oscar de Leon is like
he's the guy.
Salsero, like a big salsa artist, one of the biggest or the greatest of all time. He's still alive.
What's his name again?
Oscar de Leon, like Oscar.
Is he still
and
living
then
in
D apostrophe Leon. Like,
Yeah.
Yeah, I mean, amazing music, and yeah, Salsero, the best salsa artist from Venezuela.
Nice.
Among the greatest of all time.
Does he live in Venezuela still, or does he live elsewhere?
No, I don't know. He's. I don't think he would be in Venezuela. I don't think he would be in Venezuela.
Fair.
No.
Fair. Well, let's wrap it up. It's been an hour and 15 minutes of a good conversation.
Wow.
Yeah, the sun is about to set, so time to finish. Thanks very much for coming to the show. I appreciate it, and I appreciate you.
No, thank you very much.
Nice. Until the next time. Bye.
Bye.